having better metabolic flexibility makes you more resilient and energetically resilient, or your mitochondria are able to keep up with.
And I think just from a metabolic flexibility standpoint, the SGLT2 inhibitor is probably pretty profound in that regard.
Just don't overlook metabolic flexibility. It is something that will happen naturally. There's this natural deviation away from metabolic flexibility.
Hello again, everybody. You are listening to Beyond Healthspan, a podcast that strives to decode longevity research to enhance your health span. So we focus on more than just aging, as we'll explore fascinating science shaping the future of human health, advancing various strategies and breakthroughs that impact quality of life, as well as your holistic well-being. So once again, good to see you guys. I'm Brandon from the clinical team here at Healthspan, and also, once again, my friend and colleague Rich is here, who is our senior scientist, also as part of the clinical team here. So we're excited about the opportunity to dive into our topic of discussion this week. And without further ado, the research article that we have kind of teased out is co-authored by Dr. Inigo San Millán and Dr. George Brooks. If you are familiar with these two authors, then you already know we are in for some pretty high quality exercise metabolism research for today as part of our discussion. If you are less familiar, that is okay. Grab our hands. We will be your metabolic flexibility and exercise metabolism Sherpas for the next hour or so. But what you should know is that these two are really world-leading experts in the field of exercise metabolism and mitochondrial function as well. So let's get into the research. The title of said research article opined by these two, I'm going to take a deep breath inhale because it's going to take a few words to get it out. Assessment of metabolic flexibility by means of measuring blood lactate, fat, and carbohydrate oxidation responses to exercise in professional endurance athletes and less fit individuals. So, based upon that title, we already know that we will be focusing on the emphasis, which I put on there, is metabolic flexibility. Ding, 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 which is such an interesting area of research that kind of pertains, obviously, to metabolic health. So, we will also be addressing the measurement of metabolic flexibility, which can be pretty difficult to track at home. So we should take a look at ways that we can perhaps improve the accessibility of this assessment tool or the way to measure this if you're interested in learning more about your own metabolic flexibility, and I think you probably should be. First, I think it would be worthwhile to give a little bit of a background on these co-authors. So Rich, can you share a bit of information about each of these fellows for us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon, for the intro. That was awesome. Great to be here under a new Beyond Healthspan brand in terms of name of the podcast. We'll dive right in first. George Brooks, renowned professor in the Department of Integrated Biology at University of California, Berkeley. He's an award-winning researcher, pillar in the field of exercise metabolism research. One of the foundational concepts that he provided or contributed to the field is referred to as the crossover concept, a crossover plot, crossover chart. If you're familiar with exercise science, if you've ever opened up or cracked into a exercise science textbook, you'll probably see several renditions of the crossover plot, which is crucial to our understanding of how your body fuels exercise at various intensities. So we will certainly discuss that. There's some figures associated with this study and this publication that we're focusing on today. He also has studied, obviously, a number of other really cool things. Another one that he's very well known for, Dr. Brooks, is lactate handling. So lactate is not only something that builds up in your muscles when you're working really hard, it is also something that provides a fuel source for the body, various organs, the brain, the heart, etc. We may not get into extensive discussion of lactate in this particular episode, but it ties in with this concept of metabolic flexibility, so we will certainly touch on it along the way. Inigo San Millán, also very well known at the University of Colorado. He has a dual appointment with the School of Medicine. He's the director of performance for a couple different countries, their cycling teams, really focusing on exercise metabolism again, but his particular area of focus is zone 2 exercise metabolism or peak fat oxidation with a heavy emphasis on mitochondrial function. So this is a super cool paper to look at for today. It's a treat to take a closer look at this research co-authored by these two leading researchers in the field. So Brandon, I'd love to know what are goals for discussion today just to keep us on the rails here.
Well, it should probably come as no surprise. We want to certainly define really what is metabolic flexibility, and I think there's a bit to dive into there. We'll certainly have some of the data to explore from these two gentlemen in this research paper. I think we'll understand a little bit better about maybe what is carbohydrate oxidation, what is fat oxidation, how does lactate play into this, and maybe we'll talk a little bit VO2 and how to kind of improve some of these things, and then What are the actionable items that people can take away from today to improve their metabolic flexibility, assuming that it is a key component of overall health, metabolic health? And I'm going to say yes, it probably is. So I guess we can
Agreed.
kind of dive into that first goal there with really, I guess, setting the stage a little bit on what is metabolic flexibility. What does that mean?
Definitely. That's a great start point. So there was a long research title published not too long ago, but it was interesting, in a title to just refer to people as less fit. Seems like it would be maybe a faux pas to refer to people as less fit in today's day and age or culture. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about the metabolic flexibility component to get us started, just so everyone's oriented. Metabolic flexibility, originally first described in the research 1980s, maybe late 1990s, when it first kind of was coined, metabolic flexibility, the actual term itself. Prior to that, there was metabolic plasticity, it was referred to, or metabolic adaptability in the early 1980s, 1983 roughly. Metabolic flexibility was actually coined by Dr. Kelly and colleagues in a 1999 paper. They studied the fuel selection in skeletal muscle between lean and or obese individuals after an overnight fast. And that was kind of the first publication record of it. Since then, especially picked up speed maybe 2010, 2015, and I guess near and dear to my heart, which we probably will touch on at some point, intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding kind of brought about this enhanced focus on metabolic flexibility, as those two are pretty tightly linked, which we'll get into. This is an important component of overall metabolic health. Probably not necessarily the exact same thing. We kind of probably, I guess I'd describe it more as, you have 10 what classify as fingers or digits on your hand, right, Brandon? But one of them is a thumb. So a thumb is a finger, but not all fingers are thumbs and that kind of thing. So you can be metabolically healthy, but then still lack metabolic flexibility. I don't know if that analogy holds up with the fingers and thumbs thing, but that's kind of how I think of it. So we want to discuss that and get into that a little bit. But basically, what is metabolic flexibility? Metabolic flexibility is your body's ability to shift fuels, and ideally you can shift fuel state or primary fuel source as seamlessly as possible to meet your energy demands. And you would like to be able to do this with precision. If you cannot precisely shift fuels to meet, if your energy demands are X, you want X amount of energy. If your energy demands shift because you're becoming more active or doing something physical, or you have even a mental stress load, your brain drives more energy need, and your energy need becomes Y, you want to be able to hit Y and shift between X and Y, for example, pretty seamlessly. If you cannot do that, that will constitute some energy stress. And when your cells or your body experiences energy stress, there's a variety of kind of downstream pathways that we'll probably dive into a little bit, but it limits your ability to maintain healthy blood fuel levels, can impact biomarkers, for example. With metabolic health, that seems to be something that would be really crucial. Metabolic health, I've done some writing on in the past, and I have an interesting relationship, I guess, or the way that I interact with metabolic health, because I am aware that and pursue metabolic health in my own health journey, but also for others, I'm trying to help translate and educate people about metabolic health in many instances, how you're going to get there with lifestyle or potentially molecules change agents that you might be able to utilize to achieve better metabolic health. But the definition is flawed within the research. There's not a great consensus within the literature about what metabolic health is. It's often defined by avoidance of markers that would classify as metabolic syndrome. So we know what classifies metabolic syndrome. You have these static markers of blood pressure and lipids and glucose, body weight, waist circumference, those types of things. And we know, if your triglycerides are too high, that's like a marker that you would be, one of the criteria have been met for metabolic syndrome. And the idea is you're metabolic healthy if you don't have any of those. Don't know that that's the best definition. With metabolic flexibility, it's a different state altogether, right? It's more of a dynamic state where you're trying to have this transition take place with your fuel need is met with precision, but also you can shift fuels between perhaps carbs and fats would be the two primaries. So we'll walk through that. We'll get into some exercise metabolism along the way because it's kind of impossible to talk about metabolic flexibility without first describing how your body changes in response to different exercise intensities.
Cool. Thanks for the primer, Rich, there.
No problem.
I think your fervor for this whole metabolic health thing comes off not only in, your own life, but certainly the way you write, and then kind of what has landed us, in both of our career paths, which have followed pretty well. And this is now the third time that we've had the opportunity to kind of collaborate and work together.
The clinical experience we got, super helpful, especially, some of the coaching experiences. We definitely find that you encounter metabolic flexibility almost immediately. As soon as you start navigating or helping people to navigate changes in their nutrition, if they're habitually used to something more close to the Western diet or the standard American diet, and they've been doing that for quite some time, maybe years, decades, and you try to shift them for whatever reason, maybe it's general health and longevity goals, maybe it's a clinical goal that they have that they're, looking to improve a particular condition, like you mentioned, diabetes, maybe even cancer, as you have more direct experience with working with those patients. When you start doing that, you immediately can kind of get your first at-home signal, I guess, if you will, in the amount of time it takes for someone potentially to, I guess the hypothetical scenario would be, like I said, standard American diet or this higher carb, more guidelines affiliated distribution of macronutrients, and you're moving them towards a low carb or ketogenic protocol. So for those keeping track at home, number one at home way to determine what your metabolic flexibility is could be to assess your ketone levels. There's various ways to do that. They have kind of these breath analyzers now. If you don't have one of those at home, that's fine. Obviously, blood glucose and ketone monitoring is a great way to go. Fairly inexpensive at this point in time, so that can be something that you would potentially have or be able to acquire pretty easily. There's urine strips, so there's ways to check this at home that are a little bit more scientific, and then there's obviously energy levels, appetite regulation, things like that, that if you're a little bit more tuned into, definitely working with people that have done keto or different nutrition coaching in the past, they will find that when they have the ability to kind of backlog or correlate their ketone levels with their appetite or their energy levels, they notice different things. Their energy stability is improved. They don't have ups and downs throughout the day.
Yeah, the intention wasn't to toot our own horns, but I think we kind of bring a relatively unique angle from this based on the fortunate experiences that we've had and educational and advisors that we've had over these years that kind of believe in this stuff and have proven this scientifically and brought us as part of their scientific studies. So that's been cool. And I think, what keeps coming back as the core of this is that we can burn carbs and we can burn fat. So I think maybe the appropriate next pivot here is to kind of understand this exercise metabolism a little bit and some of these, I guess, pathways that burn fuel and maybe what does what and what the names of these things are so we can wrap our heads around what might be going on underneath the surface.
Sure. Yeah, we should definitely dive into getting a bit better picture of what drives some of this energy need and then the metabolism that follows. Quick primer on exercise metabolism. Rule number one, humans rarely burn exclusively one fuel for energy. There are some exceptions to that rule, but I think even at peak exercise intensity where you would expect, you're pretty much almost locked into a carb burn state, which we'll talk about. Even in that case, you're going to be generating lactate, and the lactate will be also utilized as a fuel in some capacity for different organs like the heart and the brain to help your body clear that lactate. So yeah, in any given state, you're going to be burning more than one fuel, and you may have a primary fuel, and in some cases, we just want to touch on which one your primary fuel is and try to optimize for that in different situations. So when we look at how energy systems work out during exercise, a lot of this is determined by your duration of exercise, the targeted duration potentially, as well as your intensity, which are kind of linked, right? If you're going to work very long duration, several hours, ultra endurance type work, where people are going 12 hours, 24 hours continuous exercise, in order to fuel that successfully, your primary fuel should be and likely is fat. So we'll get into that. And I'm looking at a visual aid, if you will. There's a couple things to just note on this visual. It's a comparison of power and time. As the power or the intensity of exercise is higher on the y-axis, you will be in a shorter time frame and you will operate on Usually it's going to be stored fuel sources, which we have a small amount of, or anaerobic carb burning. And then as you move out into the longer time frame, the power output drops. You can sustain this activity longer, but you're going to be operating in, usually, ideally, the longer you go, the more fat you're going to be burning as a primary fuel source. You do have a small amount of ATP just stored in your skeletal muscle, in your heart, etc. Organs that you need to have energy at all times. You do have a small little reserve of ATP. Usually that's going to be something, in terms of time frame, something very short, like a second, partial second, fractional second. You can think of, like, if you're familiar with Olympic lifting, or maybe a vault or pole vault, like there's certain, high jump, there's certain activities in athletics or competition that you would optimize for that stored ATP component. After that, in the maybe multiple seconds to 10 seconds, 20 seconds time frame, you have creatine phosphate system. That's going to be like your sprints, right? So 100-meter sprint, roughly under 15 seconds. If you're super good, under 10 seconds, all the way out to maybe you're starting to get into like the 15 to 30 second range. So you might be looking at some phosphocreatine system energy production for football play, like one football play, for example, probably 15 to 30 seconds. After that, you have anaerobic glycolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen or carbohydrates in an anaerobic system where you're not going to be utilizing oxygen. You can derive energy that way. You don't get as much energy per unit oxygen as you would if you were to burn that carbohydrate, that glycogen, in an aerobic setting in the mitochondria, but you still get energy, and it's a rapid form of energy. So this is going to be things that often last up to about 60 seconds. So you're kind of in that 30 to 60 seconds, maybe a little bit longer time frame, 2 minutes up to 4 minutes. If you're really well trained in the anaerobic glycolysis, you can kind of expand that range a bit. That's going to be like a hockey line, up to, in some cases, like a really fast mile time in the 4-minute range, potentially, or somewhere in that range. From there, you have aerobic glycolysis. You're going to burn carbohydrates, but now you're burning them in the mitochondria, utilizing oxygen, and you can get more energy per unit glucose or glycogen in that case. You have aerobic glycolysis. And then for even longer events, the aerobic glycolysis carbohydrate burning mechanism, probably about an hour, 2 hours or so, you're going to start running out of your glycogen stores. You might have about 2,000 kilocalories of glycogen stored up. So you can exhaust that in a couple hours, from which point on, any exercise that you're doing for 2+ hours, hopefully your primary fuel source is fat. You can always fuel during your races and such. There's some nutrition components there. But fats provide the most fuel per unit gram. So you have carbs, 4 calories per gram. Fats would be over 2 times that, 9 calories per gram. They are great when you are moving slower and you want to operate or exercise for a long time. Fats are a beautiful fuel for supporting that type of activity. When you're moving faster and you need peak exercise intensity, you're likely going to be burning more carbs, and they become a primary fuel source. So with that, but it's derived from intensity. So you could, even at rest, it's fairly low intensity. Ideally, your primary fuel source is a fat fuel source at rest. It will hopefully make sense especially when we show this crossover concept, which was articulated in this study. And I'm hoping that's going to provide a nice primer as we get into this. If there's anything I missed along the way, Brandon?
No, I think you nailed it, and I think it's important to have that framework and understanding of how these systems work, and I think that makes it actionable for people to understand different types of intensities of exercise, durations of exercise, and when you're going to start using these things and kind of get into this crossover concept, which brings us to some of the data at this point in the study that these two gentlemen did with this paper. All right, so I guess the study aim, or what they were trying to accomplish with this study, was to examine the relationships between lactate, which you talked about, and fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation rates during exercise in these different populations. So obviously different populations are going to have different capacities and abilities to kind of have this metabolic flexibility, which is important. And this kind of is expressed in pretty widely different levels of oxidative capacity. So just to kind of quickly define what oxidative capacity is, it's essentially the muscle's ability to use oxygen efficiently for thus energy production. So it's a measure of how much oxygen a muscle can kind of take in and utilize per unit. of mass and time, and it's obviously thus pretty crucial for really any exercise, but certainly endurance exercise too. So when you measure lactate along with this carbohydrate and fat oxidation rates, it's kind of a way to, I guess if you want to call it, indirectly assess your mitochondrial function and then metabolic flexibility, which is what we keep hammering home here. So a quick note about lactate: it is a surrogate measure for mitochondrial health and function, and usually requires, some pretty sophisticated kind of lab instruments, potentially a muscle biopsy, maybe some other kind of cell collection. So heavier stuff. But the three different groups that we had here in this study were professional athletes, so they were professional cyclists. We had moderately active groups, so we would call it about 150 minutes of activity per week. And then the third group, untrained / they had metabolic syndrome. So this was diagnosed, and then they had less than 1 day of activity per week. So Rich, you kind of teased out what metabolic syndrome means, but just to share with people one more time, the criteria that are kind of bucketed in with metabolic syndrome: you have to have 3 or more of the central obesity, high triglycerides, low HDL, high blood pressure, or a high fasting blood sugar. So 3 of those things will classify as metabolic syndrome. So that third group had something in that bucket. The nutrition recommendations for this study: so pre-exercise, they asked them to have more than 50% of their calories come from carbohydrates. So night before the test and then day of the test, that was the nutritional instruction. For the actual exercise protocol itself, they were cycling. So it was a 15-minute warm-up, staying under 100 watts, which is pretty easy going kind of wattage. For that 15 minutes immediately into the test, so every 10 minutes they would bump up that wattage by 35. During that period, they were measuring a couple things. So heart rate throughout, so they had one of the polar monitors on. They measured indirect calorimetry, which is essentially energy expenditure. So they're looking at oxygen taken in, carbohydrate or CO2 taken out or produced at that point. And if you've ever seen it or done it, it looks a little bit, I guess, archaic. You got a mask on you, there's a metabolic cart, there's tubes and stuff everywhere. So you're kind of trying to do all this huffing and puffing on the bike while you have this mask over your face. So not the most comfortable, but obviously it's very accurate and kind of tells us this picture about what we'll get into as the crossover concept and this measure of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So final thing that they measured was the lactate, and this is going to sound goofy if you're not familiar with it, but they can actually do it in the earlobe is the most common spot. You can imagine if you're up and going on a bike, that's probably the most, I guess, still piece of the body to kind of capture that really quickly. So it's lactate testing or lactate threshold testing is what they're trying to capture at that point. And that helps us kind of determine the point at which lactate begins to accumulate pretty rapidly in the blood during this what is approaching intense exercise bout. And that's going to kind of tell us that point where we're switching or making the transition from the aerobic system to the anaerobic metabolism system. So there's the study design. We have the nutrition, we have the exercise component, we have what we're actually measuring. So let's kind of start to get into the data and what we kind of figured out from this, Rich.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brandon. Yeah, the earlobe testing is interesting. It's not a full pierce of the earlobe. It's more just a surface, small puncture, allows to get a capillary sample to test lactate. So diving right into study data, looking at table 1, this is pretty common of most research. You'll find a subject characteristics or a baseline participant data when you kick off the study, just to give a little bit of a context between, about who they were looking at and testing. In this case, which is different from many studies, they significantly have differences, but it was on purpose, like Brandon had said, right? We've got the professional athlete group, the moderately active, and then this Met-Syn group. The idea was to select 4 people that are likely to have very different metabolic flexibility and very different capacity for utilizing of, different fuels, carbs or fats, and then as a result, the production of lactate will be a product or in response to their ability to select for specific fuels. So with that being said, the significant differences that are apparent and we should probably note in table 1, body fat percentage in the professional athletes average was 9.7%, which is quite low. It makes sense, they're professional athletes. For the moderately active, still actually pretty respectable, quite low, 14% body fat. For the metabolic syndrome patients or subjects, participants, whatever you'd like to call them, it was 43.5% body fat. So it was a dramatic shift from the more active cohorts. VO2 max for the athletes was quite high, 74 milligrams per kilogram per minute. That's definitely in the competitive international elite athlete level. For the moderately active individuals, the VO2 max was 49.6, which is pretty good. Actually, a college age male, female, you'd expect them to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like mid high 30s to mid 40s. So this is a little bit above college age kind of healthy individual, even though the age of the moderate athletes was 40 years old. So for 40 years old, having a VO2 roughly 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute is quite good. Definitely we're confirming that 150 minutes per week of exercise, keeping up with the guidelines. Metabolic syndrome, the VO2 max was 26.9, so they were under 30. There are some diagnostic criteria. Some of them are associated with different conditions like heart failure, for example, where, at 19 milliliters per kilogram per minute, you are now someone that you might flag or might be considered in a heart failure range. So this is roughly 7 milliliters per kilogram per minute above that threshold, 7, 8. Doesn't mean that they're going to be in the heart failure category or not doing any diagnostics here. I'm just telling you, like, there are classifications and their VO2 max is on the lower side, which you probably would expect. And then, as you might expect as well, the maximal power output during their exercise test for professional athletes versus the moderate and the metabolic syndrome were significantly different as well. Maximal power output average for the professional athletes was 378 watts. Moderate athletes were 246 or almost 250, and then the metabolic syndrome patients actually got to 216. So that is a little bit interesting, believe it or not, that the professional athletes got to such a high wattage, considering the VO2 max disparity was a little bit less on that side, but on the wattage or power output side, the power output that moderate athletes reached was not terribly higher. Was it 30 watts? If I'm doing the math quick, 30 watts higher than the metabolic syndrome patients. So the disparity was a lot larger in terms of like the actual work output they were able to produce on that competitive or professional stage. So hopefully that orients you to like what we've got going on. We've got these 3 different groups. They were different on purpose, and the goal of the study was to just analyze them to figure out how can we assess metabolic flexibility using these metabolic carts or this indirect calorimetry, and then, what can we learn about how people utilize fuel if they're different levels of training, for example. So moving forward into some more of the data, there was a number of other tables that give you a little bit more close or descriptive breakdown of carbohydrate oxidation, rate of fuel demand, lactate production. So just diving into a little bit of that. A couple notes that you'll see in each group during peak exercise, according to the indirect calorimetry, everyone was burning 0 grams per minute of fat. Now, again, their peak exercise intensity or their watt output, their power or workload was different because for them, for example, metabolic syndrome, their max was around 200 watts, 215, 216, versus with the professional athletes, it was more like 375, getting up near that 400 watt mark, which is pretty high. You can also see when you're looking at some of these that lactate levels were pretty high, especially as you get closer to peak exercise. And that is another, like Brandon had said, it's a surrogate marker for carbohydrate burning. So like we had talked about with anaerobic glycolysis or anaerobic glucose or carbohydrate breakdown, when you do that, you produce lactate as an end product, and it will accumulate in the blood. So your body will try to clear it. Your body has a sodium bicarbonate buffering system for that. Also has different lactate fueling strategies where you can take some of that excess lactate and like use it to help fuel the brain, heart, and even your skeletal muscles can actually use it. So lactate's really interesting. Again, we kind of mentioned it's probably worth having a separate episode on lactate in particular, but there's a term, lacthormone, right? Play on the word hormone, because lactate does have some signaling effects when it's elevated in the blood. It's believed it's important for BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it helps with neuroplasticity. That's one reason that exercise is really good for the brain and body, but it's also believed that it actually has a role or a signaling effect in terms of inhibiting fat metabolism. So we're going to kind of get into a little bit of this. Definitely something to talk about. Lactate when you're exercising is, if it's high, it's expected, normal. That's okay because you're going to be prioritizing that carbohydrate burning anyways. You want to get more fuel, or your turnover rate, right? Your rate of energy burning or creation needs to be high. So you kind of want to optimize for more carbohydrate burning. So shutting off temporarily fat metabolism is good. But at rest, you do not want your lactate to be elevated because it will reduce your ability to burn fat at rest. And like we had said, at rest, hopefully fat is more or less your primary fuel source for the most part. There's some, nutrition considerations, but as we look at these tables, for example, we can kind of also see a couple other things, just quick math, just to get into a little bit. For max fat oxidation, is one thing I want to draw attention to. 0.67 grams per minute for the professional athlete group. If we can compare that, right, with the moderately active group, the max fat oxidation rate for the moderately active group was 0.38 grams per minute based on table 3. So that's a little under 60% of what the professional athletes are capable of burning in terms of that higher 0.67 grams per minute. And then if we look at the max fat oxidation rate during this experiment, this study, it was 0.18 grams per minute for the metabolic syndrome cohort. So that's 30%, or roughly a third of what the professional athletes were able to do. So definitely some differences in fat oxidation. That's a large differentiator, and that's kind of what we're talking about with metabolic flexibility. And it's a potential marker. What is your peak fat oxidation? Some of the research that we're aware of, again, looking at ultra endurance athletes that have been doing low carb or ketogenic dieting for months, an average of roughly 9 months, if I remember the study correctly, the FASTER study that was published by Dr. Volik's lab. Their rate of fat oxidation was actually above 1 gram per minute. If I remember, it was close to 1.5 gram per minute on average. So you can train this both nutritionally and then with exercise. And that's kind of what this particular paper with Dr. San Millán and Dr. Brooks are able to basically demonstrate for us by testing these 3 different groups. Yeah, thanks, Brandon. So I'd love to get into a little bit more. We touched on lactate. Yeah, did you?
We touched upon it, and I think the average person probably thinks of it as like the burning, ouching thing that happens when you're approaching failure in like a weightlifting set or something like that. But the authors had mentioned a couple of times that it's really also a marker of metabolic flexibility, which we keep talking about here. So that, in addition to the carb and fat oxidation, and how I guess the 3 of these start to tie together: the lactate, the carb, and the fat oxidation.
Yeah, they definitely are linked. Lactate serves as that surrogate for carbohydrate metabolism, as we said. We kind of brought up that lactate can be elevated at rest, which is often a sign that your metabolic health or your metabolic flexibility is deviated out of what would be considered ideal or optimized. So in order to look at this, there was a figure 5 basically in the study, was something to maybe take a quick look at, where they were looking at blood lactate concentration, and they compared that with power output as well as carb oxidation. And you can see pretty clearly that for the, I guess we'll start, the easiest way to start would be to start with the metabolic syndrome folks, that there is a quick parallel trajectory with lactate and carb oxidation for an increase in workload at any point in the exercise test for the metabolic syndrome folks. When we compare that with the most drastic difference, right, in the professional athlete cohort, you can see that it was a while. They were exercising, again, these were 10-minute stages. So they were exercising for quite a while, and they had gone through several stages before lactate really begins that precipitous rise, and same thing with carbohydrate oxidation. So we'll talk about that. We'll definitely get into some crossover plot information too to kind of demonstrate that for folks. But when we look at figure 5, we can see that with these individuals that were a little less trained, even the moderately active group, it was roughly around 150 watts for that moderately active cohort, where lactate began to rise a little bit more considerably, and carbohydrate oxidation parallel that rise, and that reliance was much higher. So basically all that indicates is that they were at a closer to max intensity at that lower wattage range, meaning that they had to check into or rely on more of their anaerobic energy production, and therefore we're generating a bit more lactate as a result. The other thing to really make note of is that start point for each individual group. So for the professional athletes and the moderately active individuals, that start point around 125 watts, we'll call it, based on figure 5, their lactate was still at about 1 millimoles per liter, or 1 millimolar concentration. That was not the case with the metabolic syndrome individuals, where at that, actually it was closer to 100 watts for that group. They were already at 2 millimoles per liter, or they had, double the lactate concentration that the other two groups had at that real low exercise intensity. So chances are during the warm-up and at rest, they probably had elevated lactate levels, indicating that they were kind of potentially locked in, as we kind of mentioned, to a little bit higher carb reliance, even when they're at rest, kind of doing their daily thing, their daily activities, or doing the more sedentary behavior type stuff. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as we move forward.
So you can pretty much see a pretty distinct disparity between the metabolic flexibility between these different groups here, from the professional cyclists, from the moderate intensity active adult, and then the metabolic syndrome group. So that's all good and well. That's fun. But I think what really drives this point home is what we've been waiting for, is this crossover concept. And I think figure 6 within this study is what, nail in the coffin, is what really kind of essentially sets the actionable item for people and what they need to know in terms of designing plans and whatever they might be training for, whether it be activities of daily life. Now you can know, here's my crossover point. Here's where I make this switch, and how do I design a plan to achieve what I want to achieve?
Absolutely. Yeah. Figure 6, by far my favorite of the paper. We can dive into that a bit. We'll make sure we provide a nice visual for everyone along the way. It is the world famous crossover plot. When you get a visual of this and you're trying to orient, you'll notice it's got a dual y-axis, which is characteristic of the crossover plot. You've got carbohydrate oxidation on the left-hand side in grams per minute, and fat oxidation grams per minute on the right-hand side. And then you could do heart rate as an indication of exercise intensity, but in this case, it's a nice breakdown here for figure 6 with power output in watts. So you can clearly see that there's a difference in the way that these graphs are set up between figure 6A, B, and C. We'll start with A. That's the professional athlete cohort. Interesting things to note as we're comparing, contrasting, and we'll try to zoom it out actually at, after taking a look at this figure more closely to get an idea of metabolic flexibility, metabolic health. How do they intersect? What are we going to do with this now that we've taken a look at this study in its totality? Kick this off. We'll first take a look at the fat oxidation curve, which in all of these graphs is the uncolored for professional athletes. This ends up being an uncolored diamond curve. You can see that there's actually an increase in fat oxidation rate from roughly 125 watts or so up to around 250 watts. That is a demonstration of the metabolic flexibility and the capacity these participants had to increase their fat oxidation rate to meet the energy demand of their increasing exercise workload. That's very cool to see. Not everyone has that capacity, and it is certainly a marker for enhanced metabolic flexibility. If we isolate that fat oxidation and layer in the carb oxidation graph, which is the colored in diamonds on that line that starts a little lower, carb oxidation is low at the start, at the lower intensities. You'd expect that you're primarily going to be relying on fat oxidation if you're metabolically flexible and you've been training, you've got the machinery in your mitochondria and all that to accommodate more fat burning, which is a favorable trait to have. As the intensity of exercise increases, you can see that there's a gradual increase in carbohydrate oxidation, and it does kind of tick up. The rate of reliance on carbohydrates kind of shifts. If you had a trend line for the graph before you get to 300 watts, you would notice that it's a gradual increase in the carb oxidation. And then after 300 watts, you can see that the severity of that incline goes up a little bit. There's a couple other points that we should at least take a look at here. The intersection point, or the crossover between the two, happens around 300 watts. That's a good thing to know, more so in the training context. In Dr. Inigo San Millán's case, he's focused in many cases on mitochondrial function, peak fat oxidation, zone 2 exercise. You can see where peak fat oxidation is for these athletes. This is an average for the group, but it's around 250 or just shy of 250 watts. They were burning a little bit over 0.6 grams per minute for fat oxidation at that intensity, which is quite good. So you'd want to target that. If you wanted to push that fat oxidation peak above 0.6 or 0.7, you would want to train at that intensity more to help your body get the signal to increase fat oxidation rates. Similarly, at the crossover point, around 300 watts for this cohort of professional athletes, certainly a respectable target for crossover. That's going to be the point where your ability to meet energy demand has begun falling for sure, and you're now switching to a primary reliance on carbohydrate fuel sources. You're going to begin to accumulate more lactate as a result. This would be considered lactate threshold or onset of blood lactate, depending on how deep into the lactate literature you're getting. This will be the point at which, if you were trying to get an endurance race performance optimized, you want to push this transition, this crossover, as far to the right on the graph as possible. So instead of operating at 300 watts or less to prioritize or primary fuel be fat to allow you to compete, you want to push that towards 350 or as high as you can get this wattage for your crossover point. That means that you can cycle faster or harder. You have more work output. And that actually is many times the differentiator in people that if you're competing with all professional athletes in this case, where VO2 max is 70 plus for everybody, the VO2 max becomes less a differentiator and actually this crossover point. So actually the people that probably perform best in races often have a crossover point or that threshold point where it is at the highest wattage. So just keep that in mind. It would influence training too. If you want to push that to the right, same thing as the zone 2, you're going to want to train at that crossover. So somewhere around 300 watts would be a good target for most of these athletes to improve metabolic flexibility, the ability of fat to meet energy demand during exercise.
That's a plug for the importance of acknowledging that you can't cookie cutter these plannings for trainings for events because everybody's a little bit different. So if you want to get more bang for your buck, having this kind of information available really customizes the way you should train, the way you should feel yourself. And like I said, that's not the same for everybody.
Having this data is super helpful. That's the biggest barrier, I think, in many cases for most folks to do like this indirect calorimetry, metabolic cart, all that. That equipment's quite expensive. And then, yeah, it's just not quite super accessible at home for most people at this point, but it's super helpful to get an idea. And there's ways that you can go around it if you have good heart rate monitoring. In some cases, you can track respiratory rate because ventilatory threshold follows parallel to lactate threshold, or the indirect calorimetry shifts where you shift your fuel to carbohydrate and your lactate begins to accumulate. You can use a blood lactate meter, which is actually considerably cheaper than indirect calorimetry. A metabolic cart indirect calorimeter setup would be, tens of thousands, whereas a lactate meter, a couple $100. So if you were really dedicated to your training, you might not have a metabolic cart, but you could do this type of protocol and get a pretty good idea just by plotting lactate, as they show in some of the previous figures from this study. For the moderately active individuals, as well as the metabolic syndrome individuals, you can see that the graph looks quite a bit different. There is no gradual increase in fat oxidation at the early stages of this exercise test. You can see from roughly 125 watts onward, fat oxidation begins its decline. Carbohydrate oxidation is increased. You can see for these people, their crossover happens a little bit north of 150 watts. That would shift where they trained. If you wanted to get these people to be like professional athletes, training to move that crossover point would be somewhere in that 150, 175 watt range. And zone 2, you probably, in this case, you wouldn't be able to use this graph to really get a good idea of where zone 2 would be, but it would be maybe 125 watts or less, because you don't really have you can't really see that increase in trajectory where that peak fat oxidation rate is. So you'd probably just go off of the heart rate in lieu of having some blood lactate measurements. Ranges you might target would be 60 to 80% age predicted max. You could do a heart rate reserve equivalent to that, or if you have a lactate meter, you do not want your lactate above 2 millimolar. If you are trying to target zone 2 in particular, you want to keep that lactate low. That means you're primarily using fat. That means you're not accumulating a lot of lactate. If your lactate levels go above 2, you're not in zone 2 anymore. You're not peak fat oxidation rate. So if you're trying to train that, that's something to keep in mind. On the very budget-friendly side, there's a talk test for zone 2 exercise where you should be able to speak in full sentences, maybe not long, drawn-out notes in a singing situation or long paragraphs without taking breaths, but you should not have interrupted sentences where you're trying to breathe because of the exercise intensity. The talk test can be the easiest way to assess if you're in zone 2. Finally, looking at the metabolic syndrome cohort, you can see that their crossover point is around 100 watts. So at the point that they were in the warm-up, you may have had some differentiation where there was a little bit more fat oxidation than carbohydrate oxidation. I don't even know if you could quite call this a crossover plot. I'd more call it like a less than sign, which, it's fine, but there's opportunity for improvement. Their carbohydrate oxidation rate has already been on the increase basically since.
Yeah.
So basically when we're looking at this, you can see that this crossover plot gives a great picture of metabolic flexibility for these individuals. You can see the disparity. There's a lot of opportunity to improve metabolic flexibility with exercise training. There's different ways within lifestyle, nutrition. So we'll probably get into that next a little bit if you don't mind, Brandon. I'd love to maybe zoom out a bit now that we've took a closer look at the research, got into some of the crossover plot structure. What does this mean? Overall health, metabolic health. How are we going to apply this? Just because I
pluck you out of the weeds for a minute here and talk about how this does relate to overall health, because these terms seem like they could be similar, related in some capacity: overall health, metabolic flexibility. But I think metabolic health and metabolic flexibility, yes, certainly related for sure, but they are not the same thing. I think metabolic health is defined as the absence of metabolic syndrome markers. And we talked about what those 5 criteria were, and having at least 3 of them kind of places you in that bucket of metabolic syndrome. So I guess proof of concept here is 2 studies come to mind that's looked at that, putting a percentage on the population that are either metabolically healthy or not healthy as defined by the presence or absence of metabolic syndrome. So the first one was a 2022 study. I met at Tufts. It was Dr. Mazafarian's lab. The data set I had was 6.8%, so almost 7% of people were metabolically healthy, having the absence of any one of those metabolic syndrome criteria. So if you flip the coin on that, that means about 93.2% are metabolically unhealthy. So meaning, or cardiometabolically unhealthy in this stance, where a situation where they had at least one of those criteria for metabolic syndrome. Similar data set came a little bit earlier, so 2019, where they said 12% were metabolically healthy. So a few years later, but at least one of those 5 metabolic syndrome items were checked off. I think what we know is that even if you have impeccable metabolic health, it doesn't guarantee that you're metabolically flexible. There's probably room for improvement. So that begs the question, in the context of overall health and metabolic health, is metabolic flexibility a marker of overall health or metabolic health?
Yes, I would say metabolic flexibility is a marker of overall health and metabolic health. I would also say it's a marker of fitness or performance, training experience, and adaptations to consistent exercise. So the way I kind of see things, metabolic flexibility is more of a marker of optimization in areas of overall health and metabolic health. Just like you had said, your routine labs from an annual visit might look great. No metabolic syndrome criteria are met. No issues from that standpoint. That doesn't guarantee that you have really good metabolic flexibility. And in some cases, when you're looking at some more like the higher level stuff, for example, with metabolic flexibility, I believe that it's a higher order target than metabolic health. So you can kind of shoot for metabolic health, hit the target, and then maybe miss on metabolic flexibility in some ways. You'll still have decent metabolic flexibility, but I think you actually have to train for metabolic flexibility a little bit more, or you have to consider it and work towards it in many cases. It's not something that you can just be otherwise healthy and just become super metabolic flexible, super high metabolic flexibility. So considering that, in aiming for metabolic flexibility, since it's a higher order target, if you are to achieve that, or if you are to make progress towards your metabolic flexibility goals, in many cases, I think by extension, you end up improving your metabolic health, which is an interesting paradigm, I suppose, to consider metabolic health from. I'm kind of seeing the poster probably every school had it, I assume, but either like the childhood poster, like if you shoot for the moon, you automatically, even if you miss, end up amongst, yeah, we were about to fill it in because you're probably familiar with it. You probably had in your stairwell at your school too. So I kind of see it that way, like metabolic flexibility, because it's higher order target, you should shoot for, and not everyone has to have metabolic flexibility that rivals this professional athlete cohort. However, having better metabolic flexibility makes you more resilient and energetically resilient, or your mitochondria are able to keep up with the stresses of life, whether it's physical and you're doing work that you don't normally do, right? You're going to handle that better. It's not going to be such a, strain. You've got more reserve to deal with that kind of exercise stress. Maybe it's an illness stress. Maybe it's an energy stress. Maybe you're busy and work's nuts and you skip lunch. People that are metabolically flexible, they just push through that, no problem. People that are less metabolically flexible notice a bit more, have a little bit more struggle if they go too long without having snacks or meals, and they have different crashes in energy. Being able to seamlessly transition energy sources makes your energy stability higher. We're on the hunt for ways to assess your metabolic flexibility at home. One way is, do you find you crash most afternoons, a couple hours after lunch? That might mean a couple things. It could mean your lunch was a little bit high in sugars or carbs that caused you to have like this hypoglycemic reactivity thing, or reactive hypoglycemia, or it could mean that your metabolic flexibility is not quite where it could be. So there's a couple ways to assess that. They're different but related. You want to be metabolically healthy, but you probably also should want to be metabolically flexible. What are we going to do about that? And how are we going to actually, I know you have some training experience with triathlons where you've operated with some of your own data potentially on crossover or different things you were able to do to help target your exercise. That's one way to look at it. But even for just like the normal person that's not a weekend warrior, triathlete, not competitive, what would you do to kind of begin the process of optimizing for metabolic flexibility?
Good question. And I appreciate the comparison between maybe you crash after lunch versus maybe you crash during exercise. Those are two different circumstances, but they have the same underlying mechanism of manipulating things that we can do to improve our metabolic flexibility. I see this as probably three potential buckets that optimizing metabolic flexibility can fall into. Agree or disagree, I would probably go exercise for sure, probably go nutrition, and then a third one, which we can tap into later, is probably certain molecules that can be manipulated to optimize or promote your metabolic flexibility. Starting with the exercise component and having personal experience with doing some triathlons, I'll share a sample half Ironman plan. You can see the various zones listed in terms of how intense you're going to go with this exercise. So looking at, on a Monday for swimming, for example, you really only kind of stay in zones 1, zones 2, and zones 3. And those are probably the 3 zones that you'd most likely stay in. I don't even know if you'd barely tap into 3 if you had your swimming pretty dialed in. But training in those, you use the right fuel source, you kind of keep the heart rate where it's supposed to be, and you don't kind of go haywire. And that haywire could correlate to having a poor lunch that allows you to crash or bonk in the early afternoon at work. So you can kind of see how those things overlay a little bit. And I think that also pertains to ADLs or activities of daily life. If you're out mulching on the weekend or carrying firewood, you're probably hanging in that zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 area. And you could kind of see the importance of training in that so that you can do these things not only today, but 10, 20 years from now healthily. And you feel good about doing these activities that need to be done around the house. So I think having a plan when you train, whether it's, are you just in there to smash calories? Are you in there for strength training? Are you trying to explore all these zones as we probably should? Or are you just trying to get in there and cash in on your benefits plans and your reward systems through work? Then you're probably, failing to see the forest through the trees kind of thing and not doing a service for yourself to improve your metabolic flexibility. So explore all the zones. That's something you should be doing. We can talk about high intensity interval training or HIIT. You should probably be doing once or twice a week to try to tap into those zones 4s and zones 5, whereas, mulching or firewoods or rucking or walking around the neighborhood or playing basketball with the kids kind of thing, you're probably in the zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. But I think a predominant amount of the training should live in that zone 1, 2, 3 area for allowing this metabolic flexibility.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think since we're on the exercise bucket, I agree with the top 3, exercise, nutrition, and then you can layer on some molecules, which we'll chat about too. Exercise is probably the most powerful tool you have, modulating your metabolic flexibility in particular. It's kind of different time courses, different ways to do it, but like you can target pretty well and in an acute setting with different exercise, as you said. I'm going to have a zone 2 exercise session because I really want to increase my fat oxidation. And for many people, the nutrition signal that they get from standard diet or habitual diet, Western diet, is a higher carb signal. So your body's most of the time burning some carbs as a high priority fuel source because that's what's coming in. In that case, a lot of times you can see with the moderately active individual, the metabolic syndrome individuals, it's not a lack of capacity to burn more carbs to meet energy demand. It's often the opposite. It's a lack of ability to utilize fat to meet energy demands or higher energy demands above rest. In some cases, if your lactate levels are high or in that 2 range or above at rest, that means even at rest, your body's struggling to burn fat as a fuel and you're relying too much on carbs. Doesn't mean carbs are bad. Carbs are great. They burn fast. They allow you to run fast. But it does mean that if you want to target that, like you had said, zone 2, figuring out where that is for you, heart rate, using lactate if you have it, the talk test, however that works for you, 3 to 5 days a week, based on other research that Dr. San Millán, who we're focusing on the one paper of his with Dr. Brooks today, but he does talk about where in order to kind of get your machinery running, and you can see it in the crossover plot from those professional athletes, they had been exercising for a while before they hit their peak fat oxidation rate. Some of that is just your machinery, your blood flow, the capillaries in your muscle beds have to open, and you've got to get the nutrition and the blood flow to the muscles, to the mitochondria to activate, to actually utilize and burn more fat. So for zone 2, it's something in many cases you're not going to do like bouts of 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's something where ideally you're going to do a minimum of 20 continuous minutes. And if you have to cut it off there because you're tired, that's fine. But if you could do 3 to 5 days a week, roughly minimum 20 minutes, but work your way up to 30, 45, maybe even 60 minutes a few times a week, that would be really important for mitochondrial health and for fat oxidation. I'm trying to optimize there. Like Brandon had said, that mixed intensity stuff is what you need to do. If you get too monotonous around exercise, it's going to get boring and you're not going to want to do it anymore, but also you're not targeting different areas of metabolic flexibility. We talked about zone 2, that's that peak fat oxidation. If you look at that crossover plot in your mind's eye, the crossover point, that lactate threshold, that's kind of like what Brandon was saying with the zone 3 stuff, where you're going to want to mix that in so you can try to push that potentially to the right if you have competitive goals. But often that's going to be more synonymous with a more competitive goal, trying to push that over towards a higher work rate or intensity based on heart rate is fine. The other item, I think if you have to kind of optimize would be, again, the high intensity, like you said, Brandon. Couple, 1 time, 2 times a week, you should try to do something at that upper end. That's what's lost most quickly with age. The probably primary mechanism for metabolic flexibility training. We can get into some other stuff.
Yeah, not the monotony of it, to your point. If you just picked up 10-pound dumbbells and did 3 sets of 12 bicep curls for the next 10 years, you probably didn't improve much or get any stronger in that regard. So exploring all those zones is kind of the same thing. If you did a race or you had to wheelbarrow mulch up a hill, you're probably going to exert some extra energy that's going to warrant having the ability to transition and use either glucose or fat for those fuels to kind of push you through that extra step. Or if you're in a race, there's certainly going to be some kind of upward hill in there that you're going to have to ramp up a little bit more and maybe hit that 3, 4, potentially 5 zone that you certainly would be prepared for.
Yeah, and that seamless transition is huge there too. Like you said, a lot of this is racing. I like that you incorporated the whole wheelbarrow up a hill and activity of the daily living. You're not always going to be in a stagnant heart rate zone or whatever. You'll be needing to be able to pull on different things. Even like the kids basketball, you said was zone 1, zone 2. Maybe for my kids, because they're fairly young, but like as your kids age and they get better, at some point they probably get better at sports than you do. Depending on your anti-aging capacity and your health and longevity pursuit, maybe that's well down the road. Even in the racing context, you want to be able to do that. If you want to pass someone, if you want to climb a hill, the ones that are most successful can shift gears energetically speaking, the easiest and most seamless. I mean, you probably buy like, you probably know about bikes, Brandon, like your derailleur, like the smoothest transition in gear shifts is like probably nice. I know when I shift gears, like on my Huffy or whatever it is, it clunks into the next gear, or sometimes it spins off the derailleur and the chain, a sprocket altogether. Like, yeah, I'm sure like you're, tuning that, you can kind of think of it that way, being able to shift gears nicely instead of clunking into your gear, having it
You want
have
that
a negative impact.
that smooth transition brings us into the machinery that allows these things to happen. For each cut of nutrient that you might have, carbs, fat, ketones, that support these energy supplying pathways, there's a separate transporter for each one. When you cycle carbs or try intermittent fasting, you have to upregulate the transporters that allow each of these fuel sources to cross over the membrane and get into the mitochondria to thus give you the ATP and energy you need to do so. So there is kind of a muscle memory to that. And again, we're reiterating the point of having this flexibility. You should be doing these things the same way you train in all different zones, eat different things. Don't be steadfast in a specific meal plan or dietary plan, because there's different glucose transporters. There's CD36, which is specific for fatty acids, T1 and 2, which are specific for ketones, and then lactate removal. You want to have the ability to tap into each one of these depending on the energy demand at that specific point in time. If you have all those there, then it's like, oh, you've reached this challenging point in time physically or whatever it might be that your body says, I've done this before, I know what to do, so I'm going to upregulate these transporters and keep you going and prevent that crash in energy.
Precisely. The body is resourceful, looking for homeostasis and trying to be as energy efficient as possible in many cases. So if you're not using, your CD36 transporter to get fat into your cells because you don't really burn much fat, the chances that you're going to maintain a healthy supply of those CD36 transporters is a little bit lower. Similar for CPT1, if because you have to transport the fat not only into the cell, but then into the mitochondria that live in the cells in order to get the energy out. Nutrition signaling makes a big difference. Your habitual diet, you can undulate to meet different goals. Carb cycling, I know you brought up fasting. I'm a big fan of fasting as a really powerful nutrition signal to help your body practice and train that metabolic flexibility in the fed state. You could be doing keto, and in that case, it's a little bit different. You wouldn't be emphasizing carbohydrates as much as the primary fuel source. But in most cases, even if you just kind of eat, would be considered like the normal or traditional meal pattern for most people, where a majority of your calories come from carbohydrates, you would still be able to extend an overnight fast, and your glucose levels, insulin levels would come down to a natural baseline, which would allow your body to upregulate some of the fat burning potentials. That's one thing that we haven't chatted about extensively. And you certainly can layer some of that. You could fast and do some exercise, right? Fasted zone 2 exercise might be a great pairing because you're getting now a nutrition signal as well as a exercise signal to upregulate and rely more on fats. Doesn't pair as well unless, in maybe some specific context, you're training for something very specific, fasted plus high intensity exercise, depending on the duration of fast and your glycogen stores are. Likely it's just going to mean that you're going to be a little sluggish during your your high intensity performance or your exercise at that time. But you can couple things strategically like fasting in zone 2 or lower intensity lactate threshold type stuff. Timing of carbs could be another thing, like you said, Brandon.
Type of carbs too.
Yes.
Some people get GI situations with certain types of carbs, especially ahead of exercise. So tinkering with that, especially ahead of a race, is a major call out. You don't want to go into race day and have something that doesn't like your stomach, and then you're in a different kind of trouble.
Exactly. So the last one we haven't touched on as extensively yet is some of the molecules and how they might affect metabolic flexibility. There's a couple that come to mind for me. Interested to see if there's a favorite that you have that you wanted to chat about in terms of exercise and nutrition. Those are the levers you could pull all the time. But in some cases, having molecules or these adjuvant opportunities where you would take a supplement or a medication could help, maybe in metabolic syndrome or in a clinical situation, might help with getting past initial barriers to metabolic flexibility. Because sometimes, as it was showing in the crossover plot, it's hard to know where to train zone 2 if you don't know where your peak oxidation of fat is, because even at rest, you're having some issues with upregulating fat oxidation. So nutrition would be big there. Exercise you would layer on after you get to a certain spot where you can actually target zone 2, but you have to get to a point where you can achieve that.
Yeah, I think the third and final component or bucket we've called at this point are the molecules. The ones that come to mind specifically is because we're pretty well immersed with them here at Healthspan, as 3 of our protocols would be the intranasal oxytocin, probably metformin, and I think just from a metabolic flexibility standpoint, the SGLT2 inhibitor is probably pretty profound in that regard.
Certainly agree. Oxytocin's interesting. There's some really provocative research, probably warrants another episode at some point down the road here where we dive into that a little bit more. There's been some studies where they've shown that you can actually increase fat oxidation and respiratory exchange ratio. Brandon had called out comparing oxygen consumption and CO2 expiration during some of these exercise tests, but you can do that in a way that you rely on the quotient, aka respiratory exchange ratio, to determine how much fat, how much carbohydrate you're burning. And when they've done that, 30 minutes after doing intranasal oxytocin, there's a statistically significant increase in fat burning, and it reduces carbohydrate reliance. So there's something about that molecule, oxytocin, that actually does change metabolism.
Well, I know it's
fascinating.
I don't know how profound it is, but I wonder if that plays into it a little bit, but just things flowing better, right? Oxygen flowing
Yeah,
better.
I mean, that's certainly a factor with what we had talked about in terms of like getting more blood flow to the muscles and capillary beds opening up when you start doing physical activity. That does take a time. It's not instantaneous. As part of that, there's vasodilation and more blood flow in general. So maybe something like oxytocin, that's one potential mechanism that it would actually feed towards this increased fat burning. It does often counterbalance cortisol. So oxytocin can reduce cortisol levels. And when cortisol levels are high, they push you more in the direction of a carb burning scenario. When cortisol is high, chances that you're going to be able to reach your personal peak fat burning capacity is a little bit off because you're in a stress state. So you want to have those fast, ready to go, quick burning fuels like carbohydrates on board at that point. I know you mentioned metformin and SGLT2 inhibitors. You know, they're interesting. Both would reduce glucose levels in the blood. I'm a little bit more familiar with the SGLT2 research in terms of how it might have direct linkage with metabolic flexibility, but both could help, right? If your glucose levels are high chronically and your insulin levels are high chronically, that actually is, insulin's a very powerful inhibitor of fat metabolism, or lipolysis, which is the first, lipolysis being fat breakdown, first step in being able to metabolize and use fat as a fuel. So both of those are really cool. The SGLT2 inhibitor, as you had mentioned, is like maybe a little extra cool in that it associated with increases in ketone levels in the blood, which kind of demonstrates that not only does it reduce glucose, it also likely increases some fat oxidation in the body. As a result of that fat oxidation, that fat burning, you will generate ketones or produce ketones as a result of burning more fat. So that one's super interesting. There was a 2021 paper that I was aware of. It was in type 2 diabetes patients, but it was a randomized double-blind crossover trial, 5 weeks long, and it had a 6 to 8 week washout, which is a longer washout, but it is nice. It's a strong research design to make sure that like you've got a nice complete washout. But they did a placebo versus dapagliflozin, and what they found was that there was a lot of adjustment or shifts in metabolism. There's a mimetic effect of calorie restriction that SGLT2s have because you excrete often 50 to 100 grams of glucose throughout the day. And as a result, glucose levels come down, insulin levels come down, and that will improve your ability to access fat as a fuel. They saw that there was a change in energy metabolism as a result. So that one to me is interesting. There's not enough data at this point to make a lot of sweeping generalizations on healthy folks utilizing that, or otherwise healthy folks utilize SGLT2 inhibitors to optimize fat burning if they're already kind of in, you know, if they're uber metabolically healthy or they're kind of got an advanced metabolic flexibility already. But it is something to consider if you're, again, trying to almost dig out of a spot where your ability to burn more fat or to be more metabolically flexible is already depressed at rest. In terms of closing takeaways, I think we've reached that point in time, Mr. Brandon.
Had to come at some point, didn't it?
Yes, of course.
To define metabolic flexibility, to determine if it's a good thing, a bad thing, how it pertains to overall health, how it pertains to metabolic health. We highlighted that through some of those figures from the study and the crossover concept and where fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation intersect and how that pertains to how you should curtail a training session or just life in general. And then we ended with takeaways, exercise recommendations, nutrition recommendations, some of the molecules that might be adjuvant to both exercise and nutrition, how to pair those together from a timing standpoint, potentially. What other closing thoughts do you have that would make sure we button this up?
Yeah. Big one is just don't overlook metabolic flexibility. It is something that will happen naturally. There's this natural deviation away from metabolic flexibility. It appears with most people as they age. Be opportunistic about training metabolic flexibility regularly. You can do things to improve your metabolic health, and that's great. You can kind of adhere to the healthy lifestyle, nutrition, but leveraging exercise in a specific way, like you had mentioned, Brandon, not just going there to like, oh, I gotta blow up 400 calories in my exercise session today so I can that's probably you're missing an opportunity to focus on metabolic flexibility aspects, whether it's zone 2 to increase fat oxidation, mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial function, or high intensity stuff to make sure that you have that top end capacity maintained over time. That will help on the cellular level, right? The transporters we mentioned, you want to make sure that you're giving them a reason to hang around, giving your body a signal to maintain a healthy number of transporters. Exercise and nutrition go a very long way. So as you're trying to develop your own lifestyle or longevity focused habits, make sure you don't neglect them. Consider molecular supplements where appropriate on an individual basis. You do that with your clinical care team, but these can help get the ball rolling or dig out of a metabolic hole. If you're in a metabolic hole, don't waste any time feeling bad, because as Brandon shared, over 90% of your adult peers, roughly 92, 93%, are right there with you. If you're an adult in the United States, there's a very small portion of adults that don't have at least one metabolic syndrome criteria checked. Make sure you do mixed exercise intensity, get to the zone 2 type exercise when you can. 3 to 5 times a week would be great, 20 minutes or more at a time. Don't forget the high intensity stuff, 1 to 2 times a week if you can. You can even tack that on to your zone 2 at the end. Just get like a little sprint at the end there, or a couple intervals at the end. That's a nice way to finish off. And then if you're interested, you can manipulate nutrition, timing of food, intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding. I do think that intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding is one of the better ways to get your body good at transitioning, because at some point your glycogen levels get low. Body signals we need to shift to fat as a primary fuel. So you're kind of working on that metabolic switching process when you use time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. I think that rounds it out.
Cool. Well,
It was really cool to dive into this paper today.
I appreciate your wisdom, Rich, as always. And thank you all for joining us here on Beyond Healthspan. Everybody should have some kind of evidence-based roadmap to adding more life to our years. We hope that the information shared today enhances your own health span optimization journey and beyond. If you would like, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, leaving a comment. I'll leave Rich's personal cell phone and home address if you want to pay him a visit and thank you. But hope you guys had fun. We did. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.